Imagine walking a path where shadows speak your darkest fears, where every step feels like it might be your last. For John, this isn't just a road, it's a confrontation with everything he's been running from, his guilt, his past, and the truth he's tried to bury. But the path of illusion doesn't forgive or forget, it reveals. What would you do if the darkness around you forced you to face the darkest parts within?
The shadow's cold touched John's skin like a mist. It felt like a heavy weight pressing against his chest, making every breath feel like a huge effort. He kept moving, though. It was very quiet on the path of illusion, and his slow, careful steps could be heard. The darkness around him moved and writhed like it was alive, speaking in languages he couldn't understand but knew meant turn back. You're not strong enough. John's thoughts were scattered because of how dark it was. It was hard for him to forget about his sister Jay. He remembered her begging eyes, the helplessness he had ignored, and the accident that had killed her. That wound was so painful that he had never really dealt with it. It was hidden deep in his soul. But now the path made him face it, as if the shadows were signs of his guilt, telling him he needed to do penance. We could hear Natasha, Harry, and Aiko's weak cries coming from far away. Their sounds were broken up by fear and the road's ability to control them. He knew they were having their own problem, but their pain was always making him want to give up. But he couldn't give up. He had to do this by himself to save them. There was more darkness, and the whispers got louder and more intense. He felt like he was walking on the top of a living thing because the ground below him moved and pulsed. Shadows came together to make shapes that looked like distorted, horrifying versions of people he knew. His parents came in first, and their faces were filled with sadness. The sound of his dad's cold, sharp words could be heard. John, you've always been a loser, running and hiding all the time. Like everything else, you left your sister behind. John wanted to cry, but the words hurt too much. He clenched his hands and his nails dug into his palm. No, he said in a shaky, stubborn voice. I did something wrong. I didn't help her out. However, I'm not the same person now. The forms turned into smoke, and a younger version of himself appeared in their place. This Shadow John smiled, and his eyes were shining with anger. Do you think you're different now? You have never changed how selfish you are. Didn't you bring your friends with you? Dragged them into your mess. Are you really sure you can save them? The charge hit John like a punch, but he forced himself to keep going. Even though the truth of the words hurt, he wouldn't let them stop him. He had hidden his guilt under layers of denial for years, running away from his flaws. But there was nowhere else to hide in the middle of the darkness. He got to a clearing where the overwhelming darkness gave way to an otherworldly glow. This felt like the center of the shadow's power. It was cold and not like the light usually shine. It made long, shifting shadows that moved around him like animals hunting. In the middle of the area, there was a mirror with a surface that moved like water. John approached the shifting mirror in the clearing, the voices around him growing louder, pressing into his mind like a storm of doubt. He paused for a moment, his breath catching as the guilt inside him clawed to the surface. But let me ask you something. If you were in John's shoes, standing before a mirror that forces you to face your darkest truths, what do you think you'd see? What fear or regret would the shadows show you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, voicing our fears is the first step to facing them. With trembling hands, John reached out, the cool surface rippling under his touch, and the past surged forth to confront him. He looked in the mirror and saw a scene from the past instead of himself. Jay, sitting on the front steps of the house where they grew up together with tears running down her face. There was no doubt in his mind that this was the last time he had seen her alive. After pleading with him for help, he ignored her because he was too busy with his own plans to understand how hopeless she was. The picture changed, and he saw himself at her funeral, a man who had lost everything. In his heart, he knew that he could have done something to save her, even though he told himself that. He didn't want to see her pain or do anything about it, and that choice cost her everything. Low and grunty sounds came from the mirror. John, do you admit you're guilty? Will you carry it, or will it carry you? He fell to his knees with tears running down his face. He said in a whisper, I accepted. I let her down. I let myself down. I failed, but I won't let that define me. It won't take anyone else I care about. The mirror broke, and a bright light shot out into the clearing. John thought for a moment that the world was breaking apart, but when the light went out, he was back on the road. The darkness was getting lighter, and the heavy weight in his chest was lifted. When he turned around, he saw Natasha, Harry, and Aiko running toward him. They were tough, with pale faces. Natasha said, "You did it," and her voice was shaking with happiness. There was no fog anymore. John nodded, and his body was shaking from being so tired. "No, we did it. The shadows ate our fears and our bad feel. But we're better when we work together. They can't win." The group stood still for a moment as the truth of their survival set in. The path of illusion was now behind them, and its evil was getting farther away. Ahead, the warm glow of dawn began to break through the clouds, letting them know that their dangerous trip was coming to an end. John felt more clear than he had in years as they walked away from the evil road. He would carry his guilt with him for the rest of his life, but it no longer made him who he was. He had fought his enemies and come out stronger. For the first time, he felt a faint sense of hope. They were almost killed by the path of illusion, but it also gave them a gift, the chance to face their darkest facts and pick a better way to move forward. The group trudged forward as the first rays of sunlight touched the sky. Each step was a reminder of what they had been through. They were quiet, but not too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes from knowing each other. There was no need to talk yet. That feeling of having looked into the abyss and made it through, hurt but whole, was shared by all of them. John's thoughts were elsewhere as the road below them went from rough dirt to smooth asphalt. The bad memories of the path of illusion were still with him like the remains of a bad dream, but he was also quietly determined. With the morning light on their faces, he looked at his friend. Each of them had been through something very hard, but they got through it together, which made their link stronger. Natasha walked a little ahead of the others. She closed her arms around herself to keep warm in the cool night air. John had seen her pain. The shadows had played on her fears and feelings of not being good enough and failing. But now there was something different about how she walked. Her steps had more purpose, and her back was straightened. She had faced her fears, and even though they left their mark, they couldn't beat her. Aiko walked behind Natasha with her head bowed as if she were thinking. She felt like she couldn't breathe because her mother was always pushing her to be perfect. From the fog, John could see how hard it was for her and how she cried because of demands that were never really heard. But now she had a quiet determination. It looked like Aiko was putting herself back together one step at a time by the way she moved. Even though she didn't say anything, John could tell that she was changing. He could feel a weak but undeniable power starting to show. Harry, who was generally the busiest and most carefree person in the group, walked in the back, his face sad. He had always been the funny one, the one who made everyone laugh when things were bad. He was afraid that his life had no value and that it was all for nothing, but now that he had faced those fears, he seemed different. He looked at John and smiled in a weak, tired way. It wasn't his normal sly grin. It was something more real and deep. The road in front of them went through a forest that didn't look as scary in the early morning light. After the night's dead silence, birds chirped slowly, as if they were checking the air. The trees were tall and still, their leaves shiny with dew. They were no longer heavy. It was easy for everyone to breathe for the first time in hours. But as they walked, they couldn't get rid of the feeling that the path of illusion hadn't really let them go. The images of the fog, the whispers, and the shadows stuck with her, not just as scars but also as something alive and ready. John couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew in his gut that the road had only given them a break, not an answer. When they got to a clearing at the bottom of the mountain, their car was still there, undamaged and just the way they had left it. Seeing it sitting there, a link to the everyday world they had left behind, felt strange, almost surreal. The sight made them feel both relieved and uneasy. What in the world could be so normal after everything they had been through? No words were said as they got into the car, and John got behind the wheel. The engine roared to life as he turned the key. The sound broke the spell of quiet that had held them together. Natasha closed her eyes and looked out the window. Aiko put her knees up to her chest and looked straight ahead at the dashboard. Harry leaned back in his chair and stared up at the ceiling as if it held the answer. John had a tight grip on the wheel, and his fingers were white. He finally said, in a low but steady voice, "We made it." Natasha looked at him, but her face couldn't be read. "Did we?" she asked in a low voice. The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to answer. They had no idea what they had escaped, or even if they had escaped. They couldn't ignore parts of themselves that the path of illusion had shown them, but they weren't sure they could make peace with those parts. The sun got brighter as they drove down the twisting road, away from the mountain. It made the scenery warmer. The shadows in their heads, however, stayed there, refusing to go away. There was a lot of silence around them as they thought about the facts they had to face and the decisions they had made. As the miles went by, the thick forest gave way to wide open spaces. Even though the stress in the car started to ease, they all knew that something had changed and there was no going back. Then, just as the group started to feel a little more normal, John looked in the rearview mirror. He thought for a split second that he saw something, a dark, blurry shape cutting across the road behind them. His heart beat faster, and he clenched his hands on the wheel. It was gone when he blinked. John. The silence was broken by Aiko's word. She seemed careful, almost timid. He thought about answering for a moment. He forced a smile and said, "It's nothing." In his heart, he wasn't sure if he really believed it. The trees got farther away as the car drove farther down the road, but the feeling of being watched or followed never really went away. Even though the path of illusion was behind them, it was still there, a quiet warning that some things never go away. And far away in the forest, the path waited. The darkness moved and pulsed like a live thing. It didn't kill anyone that night, but it wasn't over yet. Not yet.
If you thought the path of illusion was terrifying, wait until you see what happens when the past refuses to be forgotten. The next story will make you question everything. Click now and dive even deeper into this dark universe.